Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Now, today's speaker, I think, really needs no introduction for a Cambridge audience, but I'm going to introduce him for the sake, at least, of the camera. And this, of course, is Professor John Polkinghorne, who's was professor of mathematical physics here for many years, and then resigned his chair, in fact, back in 1974, to become ordained in the Church of England, and then had a parish for a time, and then took on a number of different positions, becoming eventually the president of Queen's College for many years, and indeed, I have to say also, he's an honorary member of this college as well, honorary fellow. Also, he won the Templeton Prize back in 2002, and John has written a huge number of books, as I'm sure all here will know, and many of those we have in the bookstall. If you haven't already read John's autobiography, I do recommend that to you, and I hope we've still got some copies left on the bookstall. And in fact, we're going to do something a little unusual today, just before I hand over to John. We're translating the Faraday papers into different languages, and the very first paper in Chinese has just come off the press, and this is by John Polkinghorne. Here it is in traditional Chinese characters, and so it's been translated by Wang Ying Li, who is a Faraday associate who's here today, and I wanted just to present that to John.
I shall welcome the opportunity to check the file.
Just before it goes more widely, I want to make sure it's correct. So, but over to John now to speak on the future of the science and religion debate. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be at the Faraday Institute again, but it's a tricky and dangerous thing to peer into crystal balls, and so that's what I'm going to try and do in the course of this talk. And perhaps it will help to do that if we take a few minutes just to remind ourselves of where we're coming from before we try and guess where we might be going to. The science and religion world has been a world of very considerable activity in the last 20-25 years. And a great deal of that has been driven, I think it's fair to say, by physical science. Questions like the rational transparency and beauty of the universe, the anthropic fine-tuning of the laws of nature, these are issues that have been explored and discussed, and they have formed the basis for a revived and revised form of natural theology, not presented as a knockdown argument for belief in God, but as an insightful form of inquiry, saying that aspects that science has discovered but has not itself explained in the universe are sufficiently significant and interesting, surely to call for some explanation. Seeing the world as God's creation is a way of doing that. On the biological side, there has of course been a great deal of discussion about evolution. Much of it led by my, my friend and colleague, the late Arthur Peacock. Seeing evolutionary process from a theological point of view as being a creation in which creatures are endowed with such potentiality and given such freedom that they can make themselves, to use a phrase, actually which goes back to Charles Kingsley within a year or two, the publication of The Origin of Species. So all those things have been very worthwhile, and they form the basis for our foray into the future. But I think they have been pretty well worked over in the last 20-25 years, and I would be surprised if there are big new issues that will emerge, or big new points of view that will emerge. I mean, it will still always be, I think, a subject for discussion. So that's the past. Now, what about the future? Where are we going? Well, I want to just make a guess related to about 4 or 5 different developments. First is a scientific development that is just beginning, and is still at a very preliminary stage. People are just beginning, it seems to me, to be able to study complex systems in their totalities, rather than splitting them up into their bits and pieces. I mean, the great motto of science has been divide and rule. Take things apart and study the behaviour of the constituents out of which they're made. And of course we've learned a great many things that way, and it's a very important and worthwhile form of inquiry. I was an elementary particle physicist, so I could hardly complain about such a reductionist methodological strategy. From the strict point of view, and limited, I might say, point of view of my subject, you are all very complicated collections of quarks and gluons and electrons, though there might possibly be some other things to say about you as well. But people are just beginning to be able to study systems in their totalities without taking them apart. Very simple systems compared to even to, say, the simplest living cell. Some of the exploration is done using computer modeling, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And some of it is connected with the behavior of physical systems of moderate complexity, dissipative systems, really, which are systems that are kept far from thermal equilibrium by the exchange of energy and entropy with their environment. And when one studies these systems, whether they're logical systems implemented upon a computer or whether they're these simple dissipative physical systems, it turns out that time and again these systems display astonishing powers of self-organization. They are able to produce total and structured forms of behavior that we would not have guessed at simply from thinking about the properties of the interactions between the constituents that make them up. Take a physical example to begin with. A very simple physical example is so-called Baynard convection. You have fluid contained between two horizontal plates. The bottom plate is heated and heat flows through the system and is taken out at the top plate. In certain circumstances, when the temperature difference is appropriate, the heat transfer takes place principally through convection, the movement of hot fluid from the bottom is cooling at the top and then it's returned to the bottom. But in appropriate circumstances, that convective motion takes an extremely ordered and structured form. It is contained within a sequence of hexagonal convection columns. That's the astonishing generation of order within this system, because of course each column involves the correlative motion of trillions upon trillions of molecules. So that's a very simple example. It's said that you can do it by, if you're careful with a saucepan and water, but I've never succeeded in being able to induce the effect, but it certainly can be observed under perhaps more precise circumstances. There's also been a great deal of study of computer models. A lot of that's been done by a chap called Stuart Kaufman. And if you're interested in looking at the details, an accessible way into that is a penguin that he wrote called At Home in the Universe. And in that book he describes a following simple model implemented upon a computer. It's a logical model. It is a Boolean net of connectivity 2, but that's not the sort of language you want to use over lunchtime. So I'll try and describe the model in terms of what would be the equivalent hardware realization of it. Suppose you have a great array of electric light bulbs. Each of those bulbs can be in one of two states. It's either on or it's off. And the system is going to progress in steps. And there are simple rules that specify how the next step is to be derived from the present state of the system. Each bulb in the system is correlated with the behavior of two other bulbs somewhere else. And what this bulb will do at the next step depends upon the state of these two bulbs at the present time. Both on, both off, one on, one off. And there are simple rules that I don't want to get tangled up in, but they really are simple rules, which say how the state of these two will determine the behavior of this bulb at the next step of the system. So you take the system and you set it up in some sort of random configuration of illumination, some bulbs on, some bulbs off, and then you just keep on turning the handle, so to speak, and the system develops according to these simple rules. Now, I don't know what you would expect the system to do, but I would expect it not to do anything very interesting at all. It would just sort of twinkle away in some haphazard fashion, as long as you let it do so. But it turns out that isn't the case. It turns out this system very soon spontaneously self-organizes itself into an extraordinary pattern of structured behavior. If there are 10,000 light bulbs in the array, very soon the system will settle down to cycling through about 100 different patterns of illumination. They will then repeat themselves in that sort of way. Now that, of course, is the spontaneous generation of a quite staggering degree of order. I mean, if there are, the empirical relationship is if there are n bulbs in the array, it will be square root of n different patterns of illumination that result as the system develops. Now, if there are 10,000 bulbs in the array, there are, of course, 2 to the 10,000 different patterns of illumination that might be there. And 2 to the 10,000 is more or less 10 to the 3,000. Nevertheless, that 10 to the 3,000 possibilities, an astonishingly big number, of course, focuses down on just 100 different patterns of behavior. That's the most extraordinary phenomenon. Every time I tell this story, I'm sort of bowled over at the thought of it. But that's apparently what happens. So these systems have this ability to organize themselves in that sort of way. So what's going on? Well, actually, we don't know what's going on. The subject of complexity theory is currently at, I think, the stage that I think it would be fair to describe as being a natural history stage. People sit in the bird hide and observe what happens. They study these systems, they say, gee, it's happened again. Another system has demonstrated this ability to create ordered patterns of future behavior. There must be a deep theory that lies behind all this, but it's not currently known. If I were a young person going into science today, I would be strongly tempted to have a go at trying to enter this sort of area. I'm sure there are big discoveries waiting to be made. What I think we can say is we can see in a somewhat hand-waving, but not, I think, misleading way, we can say the shape that such a theory might have. What we're doing, we're talking about systems, first of all, regarded in their totalities, not in terms of their bits and pieces. So the new type of science, which will have to come in to complement, not of course to replace, the constituent interactions of the system, which will come in to complement that description, will have to be a holistic theory. It's a theory describing the behavior of the whole, taken as a whole. And what it's concerned with is not the exchange of energy between constituents, which is of course the conventional, canonical scientific story of how things interact, but it is something like, well, it is the spontaneous creation of structured behavior, and that involves not different states of energy, but different states in which different patterns of energy flow, if you like. In other words, it involves something that is not specified by energy so much as by something we might call information. Meaning by information, the specification of dynamical pattern. Now that's a concept that, again, he's working on, and it's not fully developed, and no doubt the coming to be of the theory when it is discovered will elaborate these things very much. But it seems to me that development is taking place in science which encourages the thought that its traditional story, its traditional constituent story of the exchange of energy between constituents will be complemented by a holistic story whose fundamental concept will not be energy but information. And I believe that by the end of the 21st century it is highly likely that information in some suitably defined sense will take its place alongside energy as a fundamental concept in our thinking about the nature of the physical world. Now if that's right. That's a very interesting development. And it offers, I think, interesting opportunities for meta-scientific speculation. As I say, these systems that are being studied are, though they're complex enough, they're trivial compared to even a single living cell. But if we can, I think, anticipate that these concepts, or some big generalization of these concepts, will become applicable to much more complicated systems, even to systems like ourselves. So let me make a little bold conjecture. It might even help us to think about what we mean in talking about the human soul. That's a pretty big leap from Boolean nets to human personhood, but that's the direction in which our ambitious thoughts should begin to move. I think we're psychosomatic unities, and therefore the human soul is not some detachable spiritual component, in my view. But what is it then? And of course it's been a concept that's been of very great importance to theological thinking, not least because the theology has seen the soul as the carrier of continuity between life in this world and life that lies beyond death, as religious traditions believe to be accessible to us. So what's the soul, if it isn't the spiritual bit? If we're not apprentice angels waiting to be released from the entrapment of the flesh? Well, I suppose the soul is the real me, and the thing that makes me me. And what that is almost as difficult to understand within this life as it might be beyond this life. I mean, here am I stand before you, a bald, aged academic. What makes me the same as the schoolboy with a shock of black hair in the school photograph many years ago? First sight, of course, you're tempted to say material continuity, but we all know that's an illusion. the atoms that make up our bodies are being recycled through wear and tear, eating and drinking the whole time. It isn't material continuity. I'm atomistically distinct from that schoolboy. So what makes me and him in some sense the same? Well, here I wave my hands fairly vigorously. It must be something like the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern in which the atoms of my body, the material of my body, at any particular time happen to be organized. In other words, it's information which is the carrier of personality rather than the matter itself. And there's just a little glimmer of a clue to how we might begin to use science to describe a world of which we could begin to conceive ourselves as actually being inhabitants. The world that conventional science describes is really a sort of lunar landscape. It's a world that has replicating information processing systems in it, but it doesn't actually have any persons in it. Now all that's been bracketed out. And it would be a gain for science, not for you and me. I don't need science to tell me I'm a person. It would be a gain for science if science was beginning to have just a glimmer of an understanding how I might incorporate that into a seamless account of the nature of created reality. I mean, the duality, the complementarity of energy and information does bear some faint analogical relationship to the much deeper and more perplexing duality of mind, body and mind, for example. So that's, I think, a development that's taking place. It's got a long way to go, and I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will go somewhere, and that will be something to look forward to. I probably won't see much of it, but some of you certainly will, I think. Next thing, what about the future? Well, one interface between science and religion, or science and theology, the intellectual reflection on religion, one interface that is obvious of the highest importance and significance, but is still, I think, underexplored, is the interface with the human sciences, both neuroscience and psychology, and also anthropology and sociology. We move in that direction. And I would hope to see that there will be more work going on and more exchange and more fruitful complementarity across that particular part of the frontier to mirror the sort of things that have happened in physics and biology in the last 20 to 25 years. Just say a few words about that prospect. Of course, we're all conscious that neuroscience at the moment is making very remarkable and interesting developments. It's able to study the neural pathways by which we process a great deal of the information that comes to us from the environment, particularly the visual pathways, which seem to have been very well investigated and mapped. And I'm sure we should welcome all that very much, and I hope that it will continue and elaborate. But I think that success and that promise should not lead us to mistake the difficulties of the problems that face understanding the nature of human personhood. There is a vast yawning gap, it seems to me, between the most sophisticated, interesting neuroscientific talk about the firing of neural pathways and all that sort of thing, a vast gap between that and the simplest mental experience of feeling hungry or seeing red. We don't know how to bridge that gap. The problem of qualia, as people say, the problem of feels, are very direct, basic experiences seem to me to be to pose a very deep problem. And that problem, I don't think, is to be disposed of by trying to wish it away, to say that all these feels and things like that, they're just folk psychology. The real thing are the firing of things in here. That seems to me just unbelievable. We know our mental experience more directly and depend upon it more directly than we do anything else, I think. And to somehow wish that away would be, I think, a very bad mistake. I'm not at all persuaded by the sort of hubristic discourse which says that consciousness is the last frontier which the heroic armies of science are just about to cross. I don't think that's true. I mean, I would be, in many ways, be glad if it were true. I mean, I'm not against understanding things. In fact, I'm entirely in favour of understanding things, but you have to be realistic. And you don't solve them by pretending that things which we know directly are in fact illusions or irrelevant. irrelevant to the problem. So there's just a big difficulty there, I think, and we need to be careful about it. It's just possible, of course, that we may never be able to understand consciousness scientifically, because consciousness is an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary private phenomenon. I have no direct access to anybody's consciousness other than my own, and you have no direct access to my consciousness. I don't know whether you experience red in the same way that I experience red. So there's an inescapable privacy about conscious experience. And when I think about my consciousness, I can't divorce that thought from what it is I'm conscious of at the time I make that thought. Pretty well everything else the science studies, from matter up to life, we can treat externally. We can step back and look at it from the outside and investigate things in that sort of way. Consciousness, in its true character, isn't open to that form of investigation. We can't step back and look at each other's consciousness in that sort of way. And it's just possible, I don't rejoice in ignorance, but it's just possible. That means that true understanding of consciousness will not come from the third-person spectatorial aspect, which science, part of its technique, and indeed much of the source of its very great success, is able to adopt. So that's one thing there. Then, of course, there are all these interesting studies about neurotheology and so on. People take meditating Buddhist monks, or they take Carmelite nuns, and they encourage them to enter a meditative state, and they then use functional MRI scanning to see what's happening in their brains, and various bits of the brain light up. And that has encouraged some people to a rather rash statement that there is a God module in the brain, and that's where it all comes from. First of all, I understand from people who know about these things that the picture you get from fairly detailed scanning is much more complex than that. It isn't just a big burst here and darkness everywhere else. But even if that were the story, I mean, so what? What that's telling us is that we are embodied beings. That we can't have thoughts or experiences without them reflecting in some way in our bodily nature. And that, we're back to psychosomatic unity. And I absolutely believe that so, and I think there's good theological reasons, as well as scientific ones, believing that to be so. But that doesn't tell us the nature of what it is we're experiencing. I'm sure that bits of my brain light up when I think about elementary particle physics. But that doesn't tell me the status of knowledge of elementary particle physics. It just says that I'm an embodied chap and I'm going to think about it. I'm going to have to use some of the stuff I've got inside here. So I don't think that neurotheology casts any light on either the validity or the character of religious belief. It simply says we are not, as I've said before, we're not apprentice angels, detachable from our bodies. Where I think the most likely fruitfulness in the interaction between the human sciences and theology is likely to come, it seems to me more probably to be in psychology rather than in these more reductionist bits of neuroscience. The reason I say that is that it seems to me that if you think about the interaction between, say, physics and theology, or between biology and theology, the interaction that's been fruitful there and illuminating and helpful, I think, to both sides, has essentially been at a fairly broad conceptual level. You don't, I mean, if you want to think about space and time, you want to take into account what Einstein tells you about the connection between space and time. But you don't need to know all about the solutions of Einstein's field equations. If you want to think about Big Bang cosmology, you don't need to have extremely detailed knowledge of models of the very, very early universe. It seems to me that it is at the conceptual level that these two different disciplines don't intersect, but they have things to say to each other, where we can look for consonance between the point of view that's being expressed here in relation to the point of view that's being expressed here in science. And it seems to me that the psychology is a subject and is at a stage where it does deal in a whole number of interesting and broad concepts. And I think that that is where we should look for the most illuminating interaction between the human sciences and theology. That's my view. Well, now, let's move on to another topic. We peer into this crystal ball. I think that we are due for a bit of a change in the form of the form of the discussion of science and theology. A great deal of the writing in this area, almost all of it, and including almost all of my own writing, I have to say, has been, understandably, in the character of focused, problem-addressing discussions. You take some topic, you take physical cosmology, you say, how does that relate to the doctrine of creation? What degree of consonance can you perceive between the two? So you take biological evolution, and you say, and you take the concepts of that, and you say, what consonance might there be between those concepts and the notion that the development of life on Earth is, in some sense, the fulfillment of a creator's purpose. And indeed, that the hominids who eventually emerge from that are creatures made in the image of the Creator. It's been an issue-focused discussion, and perfectly rightly so, because obviously these are the sort of topics that one needs to think about. But I don't think that's the whole form that the discourse has to take. This sort of occurred to me about a year ago when I was reading one of these big fat books about modern theology. And it's full of chapters on this and chapters on that, and there were chapters on a number of contextual theologies: feminist theology, liberation theology, black theology, concerned with the insights as well as the problems that arise from a particular context. Women's experience, the experience of the poor, Negro experience, and so on. And of course, those discussions, those contextual theologies, do address particular problems. I mean, the status of women in society and in the church, for example, the option for the poor and how that should be expressed in the ordering of our society and things like that. But nevertheless, in addition to that, they also form a particular style of discourse, a particular way of looking for things, and a particular way of a particular perspective on which to look at the world. Of course, all perspectives both offer opportunities and also offer the risks of tricks of perspective, but they are useful in looking that way. And there has been general welcome in the theological community for this enhancement of discourse that has resulted from feminist theology, liberation theology, black theology, and so on. But it's striking that if you read a book like this, there'll probably be a couple of chapters about science and religion too, but they won't be cast in that contextual mode. They will be cast in this problem-solving mode. Their subsections will be things like Big Bang cosmology, evolutionary biology, and so on. And I think that we need to encourage the development of a contextual theology, where the context is the context of science. And I say that because it seems to me that science encourages particular ways of thinking which are of value beyond their simple application in the field of science itself. It seems to me, first of all, that the natural question for scientists to ask, both within science and beyond it, is not, is that reasonable, as if we knew beforehand the shape the rationality has to take. I mean, nobody in 1899 could have possibly considered quantum theory to be reasonable. Wave-particle duality, how absurd. A wave is a spread-out flappy thing, particle is a little bullet. How could you possibly make the oxymoronic combination of those two forms of behavior? Any first-year philosophy student in 1899 could have proved the impossibility of it. Nevertheless, of course, we know that it does exist, and we've been pushed to that by the nudge of nature. Science teaches you anything. It teaches you that the world is surprising, beyond our powers of rational prevision. And that means, I think, that the natural question for scientists to ask is not, is it reasonable, as if we knew beforehand the shape the rationality has to take, but what makes you think that might be the case? See, and on the one hand, that's a question more open. It doesn't presuppose the nature of the answer, but it's also more exacting. It says, whatever you're going to tell me, I won't believe it unless you can offer me evidential motivation for accepting that belief. It corresponds to what I like to call bottom-up thinking, thinking that tries to move from the particularities of experience to the level of a more overall understanding. Much theological thinking is top-down thinking, which starts with general principles. You write a big section called De Deo Uno, which establishes the nature of deity from metaphysical considerations, and then decide to look at the particulars. I don't think I'm not saying you can't do theology that way, but I think you can't do the whole of theology that way. And I think you have to take the particularities, for example, of the divine economy, what the creation actually looks like, or what its history's been like, and of divine revelation, the actual self-disclosures of the divine nature that have been given to various people at various times. You have to take that as your motivating evidence and move from there to some form of integrated theological understanding. And I think that some of the writing in the science and theology world in the future will have to be cast in an overtly, self-consciously contextual mode in the way I've been trying to describe. In fact, to start that off, I've just finished writing a book which is called Theology in the Context of Science, which will seek to do that. I don't think it's been done before, actually, quite in that form. So that's a development that I look forward to. The form of the discourse will be enlarged. As I say, focus problems are always going to be there. They're always going to be worth discussing. But there is more to it than that. There is the broader context in which things happen. Next thing I want to talk about is something that is very perplexing, I think, to a scientist thinking about the world of religion. Science is essentially universal. There's a lot of argument along the way. I lived through 25 years arguing about quarks and gluons and all that. But at the end of the 25 years, the dust settled, and we all agree that matter at a certain level is made out of quarks and gluons. And if you stop somebody in the street in Cambridge, or in Delhi, or in Kyoto, and you ask them what matter's made of, provided you choose the right person, they will all say to you it's made of quarks and gluons. But of course, in the sphere of human encounter with the sacred reality, our religious experience, we don't see that degree of agreement. There is clearly, seems to me, there is clearly a significant commonality of experience between the great world faith traditions. They're both talking about the same sphere of human encounter with reality, and namely encounter with the reality of the sacred. They all have, in some respects, they have similar things to say about it. They all value compassion. Mystical experience, a sort of unitive experience, is testified, I think, in all the traditions. But once you've said that, there are still many things over which they just disagree. Not just the foundational beliefs of a particular religious tradition, like, say, the status of Jesus Christ or the authority of the Quran or whatever it might be, but also, strikingly, about more sort of general metaphysical questions as well. I mean, what's the nature of human personhood? The Abrahamic faith will all say human personhood is uniquely significant, of continuing and abiding significance to God. Our Hindu friends speak of persons being recycled through incarnation. Our Buddhist friends, if I understand Dr. Manata aright, see the notion of the human person as eventually an illusion for which to seek release. Now, those aren't three sets of people saying the same thing in three different sets of cultural languages. They're three sets of people saying three different things. And that's very perplexing and very unnerving. I think the problem of how the world faith traditions relate to each other is the second most important problem for theology. The most important problem is evil and suffering, of course. But the second most important problem is to get some sort of understanding of how the world faith traditions relate to each other. And that seems to me it's very much onto the agenda, and will be on the agenda, I think, for a very long time. Because people in other faith traditions are no longer sort of odd people in faraway countries who believe curious things. They're living down the street, and you can see the authenticity and integrity of their spiritual lives. It can't be just dismissed in that sort of way. But nevertheless, there are serious differences between us. And I think that this question, and a dialogue is just beginning, it seems to me, between the world faith traditions. It will be long and painful, because in each case, people are speaking about things that are very central to their own lives and their own understanding. I don't think what we are looking for is some sort of lowest common denominator, world religion in that sense. That seems to me the people who've tried that line have produced so sort of emaciated an account of religion that it lacks the vitality which each of the religious traditions in their own ways possess. So it's a much more difficult problem than that. And I think it'll be on the agenda not just for the 21st century, but actually for the third millennium. I think it will be a long and difficult part. The reason I mention it here is not only because it is to me anyway as a scientist, it is worrying that I can't see the degree of unanimity that I see in science reflected in the world of religion. But also because I think that science may have a small piece of assistance to offer in relation to this dialogue. I say it's going to be long and painful. The traditions have to meet, to talk to each other in a context which is both serious but not initially too threatening. I don't think it's any good drawing people together and saying, okay, today we're going to talk about Jesus, tomorrow we're going to talk about the Quran, and so on and so on. As soon as you jump in to the centre of things like that, everybody's defences are going to go up. So what people, if the world faith traditions are going to meet each other, they'll have to talk about things that are worth talking about. Not just a cup of tea and affability, but they'll have to talk about things that are at least initially not too threatening. And I think a very interesting meeting point, and a worthwhile meeting point for the world faith traditions, is for them to meet and to ask the question, what does your tradition make, in relation perhaps to its, and particularly to its ancient scriptures or ancient sources of insight, make of the discoveries of modern science? It's a serious question. It's a question that elicits, seems to me, significant aspects of the different faith traditions. And it's this question that's worth talking about. There's been a little bit of work of this kind. There's something called Science and the Spiritual Quest in the middle 90s. The first phase of that brought together 4 groups of 15 scientists, chosen from the 3 Abrahamic faiths on this occasion. 5 Jews, 5 Christians, 5 Muslims. But each group having a common science. I was in a physics group, there was a IT group, there was a biology group, and there was an astronomy group. And we had some interesting discussions. I mean, I don't say we got terribly far, but we did get a little way and saw something of each other. Then they had a second phase with different participants, which drew in, as it needed to, representatives of the Eastern religions as well as the Abrahamic faiths, and a similar sort of organisation. I think that was a worthwhile pioneer thing. As I say, it didn't solve an enormous number of problems, but it did produce connections, it did produce worthwhile things. And I think that science has a little bit to offer the world faith traditions as they seek to explore and encounter each other. Well, I've almost finished what I want to say. I suppose there's another difference between the past and the future, which I ought to just mention, and that is that it is a sort of sociological difference, really. I mean, my sort of generation of people who worked in this world, I mean, Ian Barber, Arthur Peacock, myself, and other people like that, we all were sort of gentlemen amateurs in the game. We all earned our living. We were all serious about it, I might say. But we earned our livings by doing other things, having other positions. And when we reached an appropriate stage of our lives and careers, we were able to devote a lot of our intellectual energy and engagement to thinking about how science and theology relate to each other. Things have become and are becoming more professionalized. People now do PhDs in science and theology in various parts of the world, and so there are young people coming into the game, and so on, and so it's just becoming more of a profession, and I welcome that, of course, absolutely. However, of course, it brings with it difficulties because while it's good to see people doing PhDs, and it's good to see reasonably accessible funding for various postdoctoral projects, the long-term career prospects in the science and theology world are not entrancing, I think. Some people here will agree with me about that. There are very few permanent positions. We have one here in Cambridge, my colleague Fraser Watts, one in Oxford, and so on. There are, I suppose, half a dozen such positions at major universities across the world. Well, that's not enough to sustain the career hopes of successive cohorts of postdoc workers. There is a sort of problem there. I just mentioned it. It seems to me that that is a feature of the scene, and I don't know how it's to be resolved. The people who have the money tend not to want to spend that money on, or a fraction of that money on endowing permanent positions. And I think that's a mistaken strategy. Of course, you shouldn't spend all of it on those things, but I do think you need that sort of structure in place. But at the moment, it's very hard to get it. Well, it's rather a ramble, rather a cloudy crystal ball that I've been trying to peer into. But that's what I think about things, how I see the future. A good many of you here, there's a good deal more future to think about than there is for me. and I'd be interested to know what you think about it also. Over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Well, we've got a microphone here which will wander around, so and we've got quite a good bit of time for discussion, which is good, I think, on such a vast and general topic. So who wants to kick us off? And Jason will come here. Jason? Yeah. Wait till the mic comes and thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I was interested in your suggestion that the soul, the real you, might be conceptualized in information terms.
Yeah.
And that reminded me that the Thomist doctrine is, I think, that the soul is that which informs the body. Now, does that, in your interpretation, mean that you, the real you, are dispersed throughout the body and informing it in all its aspects, or are you a bit more like me, perhaps, a few inches behind the eyes?
Well, thank you, David. Yes, I should have said that, really, that if there's anything in this idea, it is the revival in modern dress of an ancient and respectable idea, the Aristotelian Thomistic idea, that the soul is in some sense the form of the body. And I want to take, of course, I want to take our embodiment seriously and totally. I don't doubt there is a special significance what sits behind the eyes. But I think I'm being the psychologist also realise that you know, it isn't all going on the neuron firing here. There is all the messages and so on that are exchanged. So I think we need to see ourselves as somatic totalities in that sort of way. And I think that I think there is a connection with that venerable view.
I'm not sure the microphone is switched on, actually. No, is it? It is switched on? Yeah.
It's probably the amplifier.
It's probably the amplifier. People who know about these things will... Yeah, next question. Yes, Rodney at the back, yes.
I think I felt a slight tension between your first and second sections.
Yeah.
Insofar as in the first section you were talking about pattern formation, in a sense the mind or soul being this pattern, and then in the second you were moving towards psychology and saying that there's of course an enormous distance between anything physical, however complex, and any understanding of qualia, seeing red and so on. So how do we get there to qualia?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if I knew how to do that, I'd be rushing away and writing the greatest book of the beginning of the 21st century. Well, I'm trying to use, when we talk about these complexity, we have to use just the toys of thought, whatever analogical possibilities come from. If we talk about information, if we talk about it, for example, in terms of Kaufman's computer model, then it's a vastly complicated collection of bits, one sort or another. If this idea is to have some form of extension and application to ourselves, it will have to be generalized far beyond such a banal idea. It will have to incorporate not just patterns of behavior. It will also have to incorporate patterns of valuation, our experiences of both ethical and aesthetic experiences. It's not a pattern that is simply contained within my skin, in my view. I mean, it's very common, and I think correct, modern insight that our personhood is partly constituted by the network of relationships in which we live, particularly with those who are near and dear to us. And so, I mean, some vast generalization is being employed. And that's why I say, that's why the hand waving becomes more and more vigorous as you move away from computer models in a realistic direction. I don't think that should allow us, induce in us paralysis of thinking about these things. But I mean, to claim that one's made a significant stride in this direction would be absurd, really. Yeah. So you're right, Rod. There's a big gap there, but it's some sort of a logical analogical connection, I think might be hopeful. Yes, question.
Colin Honey. I'm interested in your developing the idea of contextual theology and the question, what makes you think that?
Yeah.
That's the very question which people like Dennis Nynham and other rigorous New Testament scholars ask about the text.
Yes.
And it's the sort of question which gets radical bishops into trouble when they ask it about virgin births and so on. In other words, these questions are asked sometimes at the core of theology and sometimes on the fringes of it. What do you see as the direction that we might go that would take that further? Is it into the systems of theological thinking, or where do we look?
Well, I think we have to look for a scrupulosity in truth seeking, and certainly that involves a scrupulous assessment of the evidence at our disposal. And for Christian belief, the substantial and significant part of that evidence is obviously what is recorded for us in the New Testament, the unique account of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the very early life of the church. And I want to encounter that with my intellectual eyes open. I want to be scrupulous and careful about it. I don't think that equates to necessarily radical skepticism about things. There are a whole range of different possibilities, and I wouldn't be as skeptical as, say, Dennis Nynham seemed to me to be about a number of issues. I mean, you can find very scrupulous people who take much more positive views of the value of the witness. I mean, this coming Saturday is the memorial service for Charlie Mole. He would be an example of somebody who was like that. I mean, I don't want to read the New Testament as a sort of textbook in which all the answers are written down and all I have to do is just copy out the answers. I want to read it as a laboratory notebook of the experiences of God's self-revelation through Jesus Christ, and I think you can do that. And if I had a fairy godmother, I read a lot of New Testament theology as far as I'm able, and if a fairy godmother gave me a wish, I could have any gift that I haven't got, it would be to be a New Testament theologian, to have the expertise that would go with that. I mean, I unfortunately, if you're an ordinary sort of person, you only have time in life to have one serious career. I had a serious career as a physicist, and I'm a professional physicist, in a way that I'm not a professional theologian. I try to be intellectually serious and scrupulous about theology, but I haven't served that long apprenticeship, which is inescapable. But I think I wouldn't. I entirely agree with you, but I wouldn't deduce from that. That means that the people we have to look to almost exclusively are those who take the most suspicious and radical views of the New Testament witness.
Thank you. Jason?
Yes, I was happy to hear you reintroduce the informational approach. Donald Mackay in the 50s was trying to tell people that this was the way to go, and not everybody was listening, so I'm glad it's still alive. But in that viewpoint, you have the equipment I think you need to discuss consciousness, because if you speak of conscious states or the mind as informationally comprehended, then it's a category mistake to ask the question, still be asking the question about science explaining consciousness. You don't need to anymore because you have this informational account. To ask a natural scientific or material or physical, for a physical account is the wrong question to be asking. So I'm wondering why you have these two things going on, this informational approach to mind, and at the same time this persistent question about how are we going to give a natural scientific account to qualia, for instance.
Well, I think we're back to the point that we've never all this discussion, that what we mean by information. I've waved the hat. Whatever information is really to be useful in relation to human personhood, it will have to be an extraordinarily rich and enlarged concept. And it certainly, I mean, it isn't going to be anything that is easily described in current terms information. It will need an enormous generalization. I mean, we all know the story about, she's called Dorothy in these stories. She's this woman who is the great expert on visual physiology and things like that. And she's blind. She knows all about the visual pathways, the process information, that sort of thing. But she's blind. She doesn't know the colour red, even though she knows what signals constitute in an ordinary person the recognition of the colour red. I mean, there's a richness of reality there, which is many layered, many leveled, and I'm only talking at the very sort of superficial level, and hoping that that's the level in which to start, at which cleverer people ultimately may be able to descend a bit further. So I'm rather keen on information you perhaps would have picked up, but I don't think it solves every problem in our current state of knowledge.
John, sort of following up, I don't know if I need the microphone here or not, do I? Maybe I do. Maybe I should speak into it just so you pick it up. So, thanks, Jason. Yeah. But sort of pursuing that a little bit more, I just wanted to come back to the whole interaction between theology and psychology.
Right, yeah.
Now, I mean, psychology, very broad. We've got cognitive psychology and evolutionary psychology, which we didn't pick up specifically, I think. But how do we get beyond this similar thing to which you alluded to in your kind of description of the neurotheology? You know, in principle, there's a psychological description for everything. In principle, you know, one can make some sort of account. So how do we get beyond psychologists having accounts which are interesting and sometimes useful, sometimes not, and theologians having accounts? And how do you think, what are the best ways to explore, to bring those accounts together more? Because I think that's where your discussion was going.
Well, I think I mean, science and theology are certainly different disciplines. They're addressing different questions, looking at experience from different perspectives. Neither answers the other's questions. But if they are concerned with encounter with a common reality, then what they say from their particular directions must bear some constant relationship to what the others say. So physical cosmology doesn't tell you that the universe was created by God, but it raises some questions, and you ask how that, if that were the case, how does that fit in with the notion of a doctrine of creation? Similarly with evolutionary theory and so on. And the same will be true of psychology. I mean, the questions won't be answered, but they will be constrained. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that theologians talk quite differently about the doctrine of creation post-Darwin than they did before Darwin. And there are valuable insights that have come to theology from that scientific insight. So that if you have an evolutionary world, and in fact is theologically to be understood as a world in which creatures make themselves, then we also see that process of making themselves, that evolutionary exploration of potentiality, will not only have great fruitfulness, but also have ragged edges and blind alleys, and that helps a bit with some of the problems of theology. So and the sort of interaction that I hope for between psychology and theology will be in a similar sort of way. It won't be each side answering the other, but there will be a sharpening up of the discourse by the constraints that each side places on the other. I mean, I can't articulate better because I don't know about psychology is doing. I have to get Fraser on that time. He should tell you about that, I hope.
Okay, thank you. We've got maybe time for one or two more questions if they're still here. Yes, one of the questions. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. In your 4 or 5 points, I just got a feeling that science is the thing that tells us the truth. And especially in the last point, when science is the one that, because there is a universal truth, will help us into this dialogue between the different faith traditions we were talking about. But in the last kind of 15-20 years, there's a lot of these social studies of science and science studies, the science wars and all this kind of stuff, in which it can also change in the forthcoming future what we see as science. So the question would be, how can you see in this dialogue science and theology not only a challenge in theological truths, but also a challenge in what science has, I mean, what kind of truth science is talking about?
Well, I think science gives us some of the truth. I take a critical realist view of science. I don't think a constructivist view of science. I think that is the nudge of nature that essentially shapes scientific discovery, though certainly there are sociological influences on how that discovery takes place. And I think that there is, I certainly think that science doesn't tell us all the truth. It's achieved its success by the narrowness and modesty of its ambition. It only seeks to look at a certain type of experience after a certain type of question. So a scientist can tell you that music is neural response to sound waves, but can't tell you about the mystery of music, that the sequence of sounds can bring to you the experience of a timeless beauty. So that's what I would feel about that. And I think the science is, I don't think any form of human inquiry achieves absolute truth or absolute certainty in its insights. Even mathematics, Gödel has shown us that even in mathematics, axiomatized systems cannot establish their own consistency. Now, not too many people lie awake at night worrying about the consistency of arithmetic, but nevertheless, even mathematics is not wholly free from the possibility. And the philosopher of science I like the best, and of course he was a distinguished scientist before he took the philosophy, is Michael Polanyi, who wrote his great book, Personal Knowledge, and he says in the preface, I'm writing this, and he's talking about science, I'm writing this to explain how I may commit myself. Commitment's a very important idea for how I commit myself what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false. And I think that is the human condition, human epistemic condition. I think it's true about our relationship with science, and of course it's obviously true, I think, of our religious beliefs, but we have enough in my view, we have enough motivation to commit ourselves, to commit our lives indeed, to those beliefs.
Good. Well, I think John has, for us, laid out really the next 50 years of exploration, and certainly plenty enough questions and work for all of us to do, and lots beyond this room. So let's thank John again for a great talk.